With the recent surge and continuation of anti-Asian discrimination and violence in the US, the socioeconomic position of Asian Americans has become a widely debated issue. Often referred to as the model minority, Asian Americans have been stereotyped as the generally well-to-do, highly educated and high-income group, but this does not reflect the socioeconomic realities of that demographic. We discussed today how this misperception may have actually marginalized Asian Americans socioeconomically, hindering their access to decent jobs, opportunities, and support that they might need. For this, we connect with Howard Shi, the Research and Policy Director of the Asian American Federation. We also connect with Mai Lai Chan, the Executive Director of the Virginia Asia Chamber of Commerce. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Let's begin with you, Howard. Now, there does seem to be a myth that Asian Americans are all high-achieving people with very stable incomes. Is this the reality, or has there been a wage gap and rather disproportionate opportunities for people who are trying to make it up the corporate ladder or trying to advance themselves socioeconomically?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this really important issue. I think that, as with all stereotypes, there's a kernel of truth. While many Asian Americans have achieved economic and professional success, there are just as many Asian Americans who are struggling to make ends meet. Recent studies have shown that Asian Americans have the highest levels of income inequality, and it's growing at the fastest rate as well. We saw that there was a study from the Pew Center that saw that the income gap between the highest and the lowest income Asian Americans had increased from 77% from 1970 to 2016, which is far greater than the increase among all other race and ethnic categories, the next highest being whites at 24%. So it's really important that we understand all of the diversity within our communities, and that's what we do at the Asian American Federation. We look at the demographics of our communities, and for example, when we look at Indian Americans, they have the highest median income among all Asian ethnic groups, with a median income of about $100,000 a year. While you look at the Burmese Americans, who are a largely refugee population that had recently arrived in the United States, they have median incomes around $36,000. That's a really substantial gap. We also, within New York City, we've done our own research looking at household income in poverty. And we found that Asian Americans have the highest household median income, but that actually, if you don't dive into the numbers directly, you'll see that you miss out that the Asian Americans also have the highest rate of poverty in the city. So it's a really split community where we have a lot of really successful professionals, but also a lot of Asian Americans who are struggling to make ends meet.
Right, and we really have to remember that there's such a great diversity of ethnicities and groups within Asian Americans, that demographic. And well, now, Mylan, how has this model minority myth in America really downplayed or brushed over the racism and the discrimination that Asian Americans face in US society? Do you think this might have even fueled the recent trend of Asian hate crimes?
Thank you very much for the question. It is a very important question. Model minority concept has been hurting Asian Americans, and this has been proven in many written studies, and people talk about it, but usually it is that model minority myth has only been in talk by the Asian community and at the research level, but it has never been brought up to the mindset of the common population. Today, 30, 40 years ago, later, with this dilemma, I think that we should look at that concept, study the roots of how our community has been misunderstood. And truly, what Howard said is so true, and that is the model minority myth portrayed wrongly the diversity of the Asian American community, because Asian American community, 60% are mostly immigrants, those who are foreign born. They are not born in America. And these come from all over the world, 37 Asian countries overall. And they come here with different education background, different language, different customs, entering different professional sectors, conducting different businesses. So that diversity of professional academic achievement, literacy, educational attainment, and business ownership are very diverse. However, when you look at the wholesome numbers of Asian American contribution to the American success, it's very tremendous. So that we should not feel sorry or make up an excuse. Why are we successful? However, we need to look at the diversity of the various community groups. They differ in healthcare, health concern, and economic and education attainment. So it is a very serious effort that we need to look at that concept and help educate the public about the disadvantage of that model minority on the Asian population.
Right, just because they've contributed greatly doesn't mean they don't need support or that they're not vulnerable to these kind of crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. And Howard, you've been looking into this. Which groups among the Asian American society in America, who have been the most vulnerable workers, and how have they been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think the Asian community is impacted in three major ways by the pandemic. First, there's the increased rate of exposure, and this has happened across the economic spectrum. We have both highly educated healthcare professionals like doctors and nurses who've been really hit hard, both professionally and health-wise, by the COVID pandemic. We also have a lot of Asian Americans who rely on service industry jobs, who were deemed essential workers and such as grocery workers, restaurant delivery workers, who could not work safely from home and had to risk exposure every day. So aside from the increased exposure risk, there's also the Asian community was hit especially hard economically. Our own studies had shown that Asian Americans went from having some of the lowest unemployment rates in New York City before the pandemic, around 3.5%, to the highest. About 1 in 4 Asians by May of 2020 were unemployed or filing unemployment benefits. So, and that unemployment rate really hasn't recovered since then. COVID also exacerbated the income gap and has a disproportionate impact on Asian New Yorkers because of the job loss, because particularly immigrants were really reliant on jobs in industries such as personal beauty, restaurants, transportation like taxi cabs and Lyft and those other transportation services, and the garment industry. And we saw that there was the greatest number of job losses during the pandemic or in those types of industries. And we also found that there was a gender impact. About 44% of unemployed Asian women have been unemployed for longer than 6 months. So they were part of the so-called long-term unemployed. And then finally, the violence and hatred also has impacted the API communities, further adding to their misery.
Well, as you said, it does seem like these trends, they did exist before the pandemic. And now, Mylan, particularly when it comes to women, what kind of social or racial barriers have been hindering American women from Asian and Pacific backgrounds when it comes to trying to get a decent job or starting their own business or really advancing their careers?
Well, in society at large, as you know, women suffer from a disadvantage because of the misconception that women cannot perform as well as their counterpart. Asian American women, Asian women overall, do suffer already from the concept of having less good qualifying paying job, is being put less on academic or extracurricular activities when being at home, and having lesser choices in occupation that they desire. It is very common to hear that many Asian American women, I would say more from the South Asian population, become very highly depressed, sometimes wanting to commit suicide because they don't see that their talents are being used. And when they come with their husband to the USA to find job, they are finding themselves with nothing to do because they are within their family social, they are not being free to find the work that they want to do. And so there's many limitations that the Asian women are facing. Some are very successful, but many are not doing well at all. And Howard data is very correct. The most recent study from McKinsey indicate that Asian women definitely experience longer unemployment, and that UI data has not been recovered. It is still bad, and it seems to be getting worse.
So really not only women, but many various vulnerable social groups need all the support they can get. And well, Howard, how has this model minority myth influenced access to such public resources and welfare for Asian Americans? How precarious is their situation right now?
We actually did a research study a few years back that looked at how the city social service funding was distributed across all the communities. And we found that less than 2% of social service funding actually went to programs that served Asian Americans or Asian New Yorkers directly. In the meantime, the Asian community has become, is the fastest growing community in New York City and is now 15% of the population. So we automatically see the impact of the model minority myth on how funds are being distributed. So we've worked really hard to put out the research that shows what are the needs of the community, and we want to make sure that there was also the recent challenge where the previous administration really was pushing to reduce immigration and make it really hard for immigrants to access government services, and it resulted in lots of immigrants who were actually actively ending their public benefits for fear of jeopardizing their immigration status. And this led to many Asian New Yorkers struggling to pay rent and put food on their tables. And it's really been exacerbated by the COVID crisis.
And Howard, what are some systematic ways that you think are needed to mitigate the situation? What kinds of efforts are needed to increase representation in numbers and also the budget allocation as well for Asian American welfare?
Certainly in the short term, we've been working with other community organizations and advocates to create temporary safety measures to help those in greatest need due to the COVID crisis. But over the long term, we really need to work with city agencies to ensure that services are language accessible, that quality translation is available for people who are applying for benefits, and the outreach is done in language to let them be aware of what benefits that they're eligible for. We also want to change how the city's regulations for allocating funding are done to steer away from large contracts that favor really mainstream organizations and allow for smaller contracts to fund smaller community groups that have the trust of their communities to be able to deliver services to their members and help build the capacity of those organizations. A lot of them are really running on shoestring budgets, and COVID has actually really hurt their ability to be able to serve their clientele in this great moment of need. And ultimately, we need to get Asian Americans to participate more in the civic life in the civic institutions of our city, being part of the community boards, meeting with elected officials, and ultimately running for office.
And Mylan, what kind of changes or efforts do you hope to see in your country, in America, in order to give Asian Americans more support and access to opportunities?
Yeah. Well, I congratulate New York for beginning to take steps to change the climate. But I'm proud to share with the audience that Virginia, because the Asian Chamber of Commerce is so involved in so many different regions of the Commonwealth of Virginia, we are seeing efforts from our government realizing the disaster of not having adequate linguistic assistance, brochure, pamphlet that need to be translated into various languages, and that's not even enough. There are concerns about health, prevention of violence, all sort of education, needs for awareness of resources that Asian Americans have not been able to be afforded because of the minority myth. Basically, the Asian American community is basically being ignored in this whole American system, although we are a very strong contributor. So in Virginia, in the region where I live, there is a county called Henrico County, one of the largest, in fact, the second largest county in the Commonwealth. They are taking very proactive steps to step in, change things, increasing hiring of people from Asian descent, coordinating more multicultural events that fit and educate the public about the existence of Asian American community, making change in the education system, the curriculum. And overall, we participate in, let's say, Northern Virginia region, the entire Northern Virginia region, to try to look into a way to enhance procurement system so that people will have, small businesses will have a better chance in competing with contracts. And thus, these are long-term systematic change, but there is hope. And I think that can only be with the assistance of the right media, the media that understand the dilemma of the community, that can help us bring that truth out and educate the public about the situation.
Well, hopefully this is just the beginning of this much needed change in your country. Well, thank you so much for your time today. That was Mai-Line Tran, Executive Director of the Virginia Asia Chamber of Commerce, and Howard Shi, Research and Policy Director for the Asian American Federation. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you for your time.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.